The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Georgia is Eric Shoemaker of Genius GRC. And today we're going to be talking about establishing the value of the Cybersecurity Compliance Program. Eric, thanks for joining us. Obviously, when there's a breach averted, you got great proof of the value of the Cybersecurity Compliance Program. But what can we do during the other times to demonstrate that value?
Hey Adam, it's good to be here as well. It's a struggle that every organization has. Everybody knows that the security program, it's there to prevent breach. That's the primary mission. Everybody knows it. Everybody wants that to be the primary mission. But the reality is the business doesn't exist to prevent breach. The business exists to provide value to their customers, to derive value or profit to the owners, to the shareholders. And in some cases, maybe there's a different mission. For example, healthcare organizations, their value is to protect human life, to meet the needs of the patients first and foremost. So then the question is, how does the cybersecurity program meet those business objectives beyond just the protecting from breach? Well, a number of ways that compliance professionals, cybersecurity professionals need to understand is that from a leadership perspective, this is here, the compliance program, it's here to reduce the revenue friction. So how do they contribute to the sales efforts is one way. For example, every organization now that deals with regulated data is going through some sort of third-party vendor risk program when they evaluate a vendor. So how is the compliance program contributing to increasing revenue or reducing the friction for getting that revenue, and then also protecting the existing revenue, protecting the existing profit? This is a lot of where the prevent breach comes in, protecting that customer data, protecting the business processes, those means by which the customers derive value. And then, in the healthcare specific space, how does the patient journey get affected by the cybersecurity and compliance program? If you can answer those questions, then you're going to provide value to leadership.
Those are really good questions to ask. Now, how can we go about setting metrics to measure against other than no successful breaches? I mean, how do we measure, using your language, less friction?
Yeah, I know there's tons of common metrics. We could talk about vulnerabilities and time to remediation, or we could talk about the number of phishing failures, or how many people attended security awareness training. I mean, all those are fine, but really it's within the security world that people care about those. The leadership cares about that only to the extent that it helps the bottom line and prevents that breach. I got to tell you, there's one metric that I really wish would be embraced, and that's reporting on close calls or near misses. So, as I was thinking about that concept, I thought about the FAA and how they have an established program in place, not just to track incidents, but near misses. So, for example, the FAA defines a close call as an incident where two aircraft come within 500 feet of each other, or where a pilot or flight crew member feels a collision hazard existed. Now, co-pilot helped me with that definition. The actual regulation's much more technical, but that's the idea. So pilots are required to report when they feel like there was a condition that existed that could have led to a collision, whether in the air, on the runway, whatever that might be. But here's the kicker. Those reports, they're sent to the FAA, they're then reviewed, and then those reports result in real change. So when you think about that from a cybersecurity scenario, it would be really nice if we had a mechanism to report near misses. events that could have led to, a breach or an incident had like one or two variables been slightly different. I actually had this happen. So the accounts payable team received an invoice. On that invoice, there was a notice that said the ACH information for paying that invoice had been changed. So follow this new process, pay us at this new account. We all know that that's probably not legitimate, but companies do change bank accounts. So this isn't abnormal. This company went through their internal process, they paid the invoice. Well, then the bank flagged the transaction as, going to a suspicious account, one that had been flagged for fraud already. They stopped the money from leaving. Well, that's great. The business didn't suffer, that fraud. They could have just said, whew, that was a close call. Glad that didn't happen and move on. But um, the mature business is going to take that opportunity to say, okay, we failed internally. What process do we need to change to prevent this from happening again? The bank may not catch it next time, and it could have left, hundreds of thousands of dollars leaving the organization.
That's a great story and a terrific way to show the value of the save. Now, it also leads to a question I have, which is what's the best way to monitor and track against metrics other than the obvious one of whether or not we had a cyber breach?
Well, it comes down to what questions you're asking and answering. So different people within the organization are going to ask different questions. Leadership, for instance, how's the program meeting the needs of the business? Of course, preventing the breaches. That comes back to reporting those incidents, reporting those close calls, and then leadership reviewing them and actually driving that change and driving that culture change within the company. But then also they want to know how is the program, increased revenue or decreased friction to revenue. So, one metric that might be captured is how many new deals have been influenced by the compliance program. And then when you're talking about security leadership, the CISO, the security manager, perhaps the compliance manager, they want to know different things. At any given time, what security controls are failing, not just during the audit, but like between audits when it's actually helpful to catch those failings. How many of those controls need attention? How are we personally meeting the business expectations? How are we meeting the contractual obligations? How are we meeting regulatory obligations? Those are the types of metrics that need to be captured, and it's been my experience that one good way to do that and kind of bridge that gap between leadership, compliance, security is to use some sort of GRC platform. So, when we think about software, we think about, different departments have their thing. Accounting's got QuickBooks or, some other accounting software. Sales, it's got Salesforce, HubSpot. Operations has their ERP platform. The cybersecurity, unless you're talking about the biggest of organizations, traditionally has just been spreadsheets. So, I'd like to see GRC platforms, those governance, risk, and compliance platforms, in more use throughout, even smaller organizations.
What are some of the common areas where companies tend to find the performance of their cybersecurity program is not meeting expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just from a human standpoint, meeting expectations, as we think about, two people or groups of people having friction, typically the misalignment is not in terms of people not wanting to work together. A lot of times it's just that misalignment of what they think the expectations are. So from a business perspective, a lot of times you hear, well, security, compliance, they hinder productivity, they get in the way, they cause us to have to do all of this extra stuff that doesn't actually help my job. And then that comes back to the security team, the compliance team has to understand what are the expectations from the business on them. And when we say the business, a lot of times we use that as a catch-all term, but really we have to drill down a little bit. How are we working with sales and marketing? How are we working with accounting and finance, with DevOps, with IT, customer service, the frontline departments, those that actually serve, the customers directly? A lot of times there's different expectations between those different departments as to how, they expect the security and compliance team to work with them specifically, and then not meeting those expectations tends to roll up into quote unquote the business. It's been my experience, if we can answer the question, do they view us as a hindrance or a help to their everyday life? And then try to come to, how do we not be that hindrance, but be a help? If we can do that, then we have, a good working relationship.
So, speaking of relationships, how can compliance and the IT security team best work together to complement each other's work?
Yeah, those two teams typically are the ones that work together the most. And when you work together with a team, a lot of times that's where the friction, more of the friction comes in. The DevOps teams that, I'm going to lump traditional IT operations in with development and the new DevOps coinage. But their primary mission is to improve the product, to meet those customer objectives through the thing that they do every day. Um, that could be delivering new features, could be maintaining that product uptime, but it doesn't mean that they don't care about security. If we start thinking that they don't care about security, that's when the relationship breaks down. But then on the flip side, DevOps, it's good for them to understand what the value of the security team is. What's their primary objective? Well, their primary objective is to keep the customer safe, to meet those same customer expectations. They might be different expectations, but the customer expects new features. They also expect their data to be safe. And then, from a regulatory perspective, the compliance team helps to ensure that the company doesn't get fined, doesn't run afoul of some law that the company needs to meet, that they meet some contractual obligation that customers demand of them. And those two teams have to kind of recognize what each other bring to the table and work together to do that. And it's been my experience that if the leadership understands that and then pushes that culture down and helps their specific teams understand the value that the other team brings to the table, and then help them to not just see the value but to work together, and see how they can work together for the good of the business, and ultimately that is the good of us as individual contributors and our families. We can do that, then that relationship gets better. And as an individual contributor, always look for ways to help streamline your colleagues' processes. If you can find a way to make your colleagues' job easier, you'll find that they start advocating for you instead of you having to pull them to compliance.
And nothing better than winning over and earning a really strong ally. Well, Eric, thank you so much for sharing these insights with us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turtletaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we are able to expand your compliance perspective.